Hopefully that is doing something. Yes, recording has started. Wonderful. So welcome officially, everybody. My name is Jessica Chase. I am the curator with the County Museums. And I'm really, really excited to welcome you all to this talk with Trish Ray and Karen Lewis, a very dynamic duo, if I say so myself, and really good
This is going to be annoying.
friends
I
of
was going
the
to listen while I
county.
finish dinner. So feel free to go elsewhere.
Oh, that's Karen. Hi, Karen. Um, Another Karen, Karen Valhora, just came on.
Why
I
can't I
think
hear
your
anything
mic
now?
is on, so I can hear you chatting about dinner. But yes, so before we officially begin tonight's presentation, I just want to say that on behalf of my museum colleagues and myself, we want to acknowledge that we are on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, specifically the Mississauga, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, and the St. Lawrence Iroquois, and that we are incredibly grateful, I know I am, to be able to live and work on this land and near the waters that we are surrounded by. And we are incredibly thankful to the generations of Indigenous people that have cared for and continue to care for this land and these waters since the beginning. So now I'm going to officially welcome Trish and Karen. As I said, great friends of the museum, and we hope to continue this relationship for many years to come. And I am going to give them each a little bit of an introduction, although I know they are very humble, as we were discussing earlier. So firstly, Trish Ray. Trish has worked as a researcher for the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte since 1987. Her work is primarily concentrated on land claims research, but over the years, she has diversified into community history, including genealogy. And in fact, she's done some genealogy research for the museums in the last few years. Trish is currently working on the history of the back third of the Mohawk Tract, part of the land originally granted in 1793. Trish studied anthropology at university and is a graduate of Wilfrid Laurier University and Bryn Mawr College. Now, Karen Lewis. Karen is a member of the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte, and she served as librarian for 29 years, although she is retired now, but filling her time considerably because she is a member of multiple boards, including the board of Jijunhat Ungwawana, the Language and Cultural Center in Tyendinaga Mohawk Territory. She's also the sister of the very talented executive director of TTO. And she's also on the board of Ganyode Library on Tyendinaga Mohawk Territory, and on the board of the Alberti A-Frame Association. So she is filling her time. There's barely any free time, although she does happen to be on vacation at the moment and is joining us from abroad. Very exciting. And Karen has helped with a number of projects at the museums, including our A Path Forward exhibit at Macaulay Church, and in fact is scheduled to come in and sit down with me for an interview this coming week. So thank you, Karen, for doing that, and thank you for joining us tonight. Of course, the presentation this evening is called Aftermath, the American Revolution and the Origins of the Mohawk Village on the Bay of Quinte. So at this point, I will mute myself and turn it over to Trish and Karen.
Thank you, Jess. That was wonderful. And
Thanks, Jessica.
So, as you said, today we're exploring the relationship between the American Revolution and the founding of the Mohawk village at the Bay of Quinte, the beginnings of the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte. It is clear that without that war, the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte, as we're known today, would not exist.
And we're going to tackle this in stages. Part one, a description of life in the Mohawk Valley before the American Revolution. Part two, in the time of the American Revolution. Part three, leaving Mohawk Valley in the fall of 1777. Part four, life at Lachine. That time frame is the fall of 1777 to the spring of 1784. And then finally, part five, the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte and the Simcoe Deed. So part one is life in the valley before the American Revolution. And I will ask Jessica to bring up image number one, which is an image of the Haudenosaunee, or the Confederacy of Six Nations.
The Confederacy of Six Nations. So, as you said, today we're exploring the relationship between the American Revolution and the founding of the Mohawk village at the Bay of Quinte, the beginnings of the Mohawk Valley before the American Revolution. Part one, a description of life in the Mohawk Valley before the American Revolution. Part two, in the time of the American Revolution. So part one is life in the valley before the American Revolution. And then finally, part five, the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte and the Simcoe Deed. So part one is life in the valley before the American Revolution. And then finally, part five, the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte and the Simcoe Deed. So part one is life in the valley before the American Revolution. And then finally, part five, the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte and the Simcoe Deed. So part one is life in the valley before the American Revolution. And then finally, part five, the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte and The Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora nations were joined together into a confederacy under the Great Law of Peace. There was to be peace between them, not war. The conflict between Britain and the 13 colonies threatened that peace. Most of our ancestors lived in the Mohawk Valley. They lived in Onondaga, the Wolf Clan, or Lower Castle. The local white community were mixed of English, Dutch, and German Palatine backgrounds. Nearby, Fort Hunter was established by the British to increase their influence on our people. This was where the church was built, where the Queen Anne's silver was.
And I'll ask Jessica to bring up image number 2 to give you some geography. The Mohawk community and the communities in the Mohawk Valley, imagine it, they had very nice homes. A lot of their homes were nicer than their white neighbors had. Their homes were comfortably furnished. Some had window glass, which their white neighbors tended not to have. It was very expensive. They had good farms, rich farmland, abundant livestock and food supplies, sleighs and carriages, plows and harrows, silverware, pewterware, porcelain, guns, and hunting traps. Some had luxury items such as silk gowns, silver brooches, wine glasses, bottles, and decanters. It was a mixed economy. There was horticulture as well as plow farming. That was augmented with hunting, but it was also an economy based on trade and diplomacy. Leading up to the war, it was relatively safe in the valley, although there were always tensions with the neighbors.
Part 2, in the time of the American Revolution, this would be March, April of 1776. In the spring of 1776, there was a council held at Onondaga, and the position taken by the Confederacy was strict neutrality. However, individuals amongst the nations did choose to support the Americans or the British. The people of the Mohawk Nation tended to support the British. They had a long-standing relationship, but it was not uniform. There were neutral Mohawks and probably American sympathizers as well.
So in the January of 1777, 3 principal chiefs or sachems died at Onondaga. And at Onondaga, the central fire of the Confederacy was covered. The question of whether or not the Confederacy would change the position of neutrality didn't come before the central fire again. So for the remainder of the war, each individual was free to decide which side to support, if indeed to support either side.
In the summer of 1777, Captain Joseph Brant was actively seeking warriors to follow him in service of the king. Captain John Desirungian, or Yode Sirungian, meaning the lightning had struck, also chose to ally with the king. The British military was offering the hatchet. Those who took up this hatchet were agreeing to fight in alliance with the British. But these were individuals making decisions for themselves. It was not a decision made by the Confederacy.
In a hot August in 1777, the Fort Stanwix was being put under siege. And at this long-term battle, skirmish, there was a battle nearby called the Battle of Oriskany. At the Battle of Oriskany, the British military with their allies, which included Mohawks, Senecas, Mississaugas, and Western Indians, were ambushed by American forces with their allies, members of the Oneida. It was a ferocious, horrible battle, bloody hand-to-hand combat. Many warriors were killed. And at this battle, the great peace that was supposed to exist between the Confederacy nations was broken.
In September of 1777, the American forces and their Oneida allies then attacked the communities of the Mohawks, including the Fort Hunter area and Canajoharie. The American militia encouraged the Oneida to plunder Mohawk communities. Both were happy to loot the Mohawk villages, take the animals, clothing, and personal items, and burn any crops still in the field. The Mohawk chapel at Fort Hunter was looted by the Americans and then used as a tavern and a stable. A nighttime raid by the Committee of Safety chased Mohawk families from their homes. The raiders were their neighbors. Many belonged to the congregation at Fort Hunter. The homes were then occupied and plundered, stealing glass windows, iron hinges, hogs, cows, and corn, as well as clothing and jewelry. Molly Brant's home was ransacked. The wife and daughter of one of the raiders were seen wearing her silk gowns. Also stolen from her home were cash and silver shoe buckles. These acts signified that clothing and homes were more appropriate for white settlers and for the moment their Oneida allies to own and occupy. As the American Revolution was in full swing, who was living at Fort Hunter? The very young, the women, elderly men, and any trying to remain neutral. The warriors would be in and out of the community as they were scouts or they were in skirmishes. This is the event that led to our ancestors leaving Mohawk Valley. And part 3 will be leaving Mohawk Valley.
So in late August to October 1777, the community at Fort Hunter was forced to leave the Mohawk Valley. If they had stayed, they would have been repeatedly attacked by the Americans and by the Oneida. Not all the families left right away, but as families did move out, American families moved right in. The largest group to leave Fort Hunter included the elderly, the women, children, and about 50 warriors. And they went to the Hudson River, and they were looking for the protection of Burgoyne's army. Captain John Deserontian organized the move with the help of Captain Isaac Hill and Johannes. There was a small group, about 6 or 7 families. At this time, they refused to leave, but they would be forced to leave fairly shortly.
Garliagigoa, or Big Clear Sky, also known as David Loft, and a small party of men set off to locate the Mohawks and guide them. Near Saratoga, they were attacked. Captain John was wounded. Captain Isaac Hill's brother was killed. Although Big Clear Sky was not Mohawk, he was part of the beginnings of the new community that would become the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte. His descendants would be part of that new community. Other smaller groups joined the main group at Saratoga, and in late September or early October, the main group, now about 150, split into family-based groupings and left the area of Saratoga heading north. Some went by way of Fort Edward, which is south of Lake George, and were captured. About 50 of them were captured. They were rescued the next year. The main group, now about 100, made it to Ticonderoga. There was a fort there in mid to late October of 1777. They crossed Lake Champlain in boats to a place called St. John's, and then north to Lachine.
Okay, I'll ask Jess to bring up image number 3 so you can see the distances we're talking about here from Mohawk Valley to Lachine. 2 men, Peter Brant and his brother Brant Brant, who belonged to the Delaware Nation or Lenape, also helped to guide the people to Lachine. Peter Brant was wounded in the move to Lachine. And like David Loft, these brothers, and the descendants of Peter in particular, become part of the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte. Having to leave the valley was traumatic, and the legacy of the move haunted the community members. About 100 years later, Lyman Draper, an American researcher, collected stories from the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte, including stories about leaving Mohawk Valley. The first story is from Mrs. Lydia Martin, and we're very fortunate. We have a photograph of her. So image number 4 is Lydia Martin. She was the granddaughter of Captain Isaac Hill and Lydia John, and the mother of Dr. Aranyadeka. So we have this story from her.
When the war broke out, the Mohawks resolved to take the king's side, and all the nation started, save a few families. Mrs. Martin thinks only 3 remaining, for Lachine, where they would be safe. As Brant was most the object of Americans, he was placed in front, and all trudged along. Mrs. Martin's mother was then but 3 years old, and of the party, and used to relate, she remembered, they would stop at some of the houses by the way and get buttermilk. The only food they took with them was parched cornmeal, called in the Mohawk onunquitsara, of which each carried as much as he could. They were pursued by the Americans, and 6 Mohawk women, lagging behind with their heavy loads, were overtaken and made prisoners, and were put in prison and kept a long time, suffering much during their incarceration. Mrs. Martin knew one of these women at Bay of Quinte.
We have a second a bit of testimony from Mrs. Margaret Moses, who was the daughter of old John Green.
The braves in the rear, guarding the women and children, John Green among them, were pursued a considerable distance. 6 Mohawk women and 1 child were taken by the Americans. One, afterwards, Mrs. Seth Paulus, who lived to be aged. The party suffered greatly for want of provisions.
And another story from Chief Thomas Green, another child of old John Green.
The Americans wanted the Mohawks to remain at their homes and take no part in the war, but so firmly attached were they to the king that they would not listen to this advice. They started to retire in a body to Canada. Captain John was in the rear to protect the women and children. They were overtaken and attacked on the way, and those in front fell back to aid the rear guard, and Captain John was wounded. The retreating Indians became nearly starved. Children would cry of hunger. Camped out, and the Indian hunters went out in every direction to hunt, killing only a few birds, and made them into gruel so as to go as far as possible, but afforded the hungry scarcely a spoonful apiece, with small bits of the scanty meat. They were then nearly 2 days' travel to Lachine, and without food. The journey was tardy, as the children who could had to walk in their enfeebled condition, and the smaller ones had to be carried.
And we have one more bit of testimony from Mrs. Elizabeth Paulus, and she was the daughter of Catherine Hill and John Loft. She was the granddaughter of Captain Isaac Hill and Lydia John.
There were a few men to guide the women and children. American Indians followed and overtook them and killed some, once on an island, and killed 3 of their number. One, Margaret Pinn, who married Seth Paulus, when young was captured and kept prisoner a while, and finally got to the Seneca chief Quinte and stayed some time. She was 15 when she found her surviving kindred, 2 younger brothers. Those who fled from the Mohawk Valley had only parched corn and suffered every hardship. Part 4, about life at Lachine. This was the fall of 1777 to spring of 1784.
This is a difficult time to try to get a handle on. We don't have a lot of sources or documents to describe what life was really like, but what we do have indicates that it wasn't very comfortable. There was anger and sorrow about what had happened in the valley and that they had been forced to leave everything behind. There was anxiety about the war and trying to survive in an unfamiliar place. And while at Lachine, the main goal was actually just to survive while this war continued.
Captain John and other men of the community continued to fight in the American Revolution. The women, children, and older men were left in trying circumstances. Colonel Daniel Claus described it as a not very pleasant settlement and a melancholy situation.
Yeah. At Lachine, they found Daniel Claus, who was an old friend of Captain John's, and Claus did his best to look after them. He found them a suitable plot of grounds in the woods near Lachine, where they built huts for themselves, and they were supplied with food and clothing during the winter. And in the spring, they made gardens for planting crops. The next winter, they moved further into the woods for better access to wood and water. In December 1783, Claus wrote that they took care of themselves and their families by hunting and fishing, but that their last crop of corn and vegetables failed due to the wet and the cold.
They had suffered the loss of their homes, their farms, animals, and their home community. They worked hard to establish themselves again in a strange place while the war continued. It was not a comfortable existence. Who knew when the war would end? Which warriors would survive? And there must have been a feeling of isolation and disorientation so far from home.
So in 1779, while the war is still raging on, Captain John takes the opportunity to raise issues of redress of grievances and the loss of their land and the poor conditions at Lachine with the Indian superintendent, Colonel Guy Johnson. Captain John reminded him that in 1775, Governor Guy Carleton had told the Mohawks to, quote, "Go now and fight for your possessions, and whatever you lose of your property during the war, the king will make up to you when peace returns." So in the April of 1779, Frederick Halderman, who was the governor and commander-in-chief, recognized that promise, for the restoration of the Mohawks and their settlements at the expense of the government, and he committed himself to that.
In January of 1784, there were 114 Mohawks and 11 Delawares, or Lenape, at the Mohawk village near Lachine. There were others belonging to other communities who attached themselves to that community at Lachine, and not everyone would move to the Bay of Quinte in the spring of 1784, but those who did would establish the village on the Bay of Quinte.
And this is going to sound a little strange, I know, but these extreme losses that were suffered by the Mohawks of the Fort Hunter area and Canajoharie too, provided some funds to help establish that new community. So we have a report that was written in 1784, which itemizes the economic losses suffered by the Fort Hunter Mohawks. The land, arable land described as rich, was valued in New York currency at over 3,000 pounds. That was a lot of money. The buildings, cattle, and movables were valued at over 3,000 pounds, and the grain that had to be left behind in barns and barracks, as they say, over 200 pounds. So it was over 6,000 pounds in sort of tangible economic losses.
This report also itemizes losses of personal effects and animals. Captain John lost a house and barn valued at 125 pounds, household effects valued at 120 pounds, an English sleigh, a carriage, plow and harrow, a wagon, 3 horses and 2 cows, 5 large pigs, hens, and a gun, and 5 beaver traps. Marguerite lost household effects valued at 180 pounds, 4 horses and 3 cows, 20 hens and piglets and 1 large pig, a plow and harrow. Jacob lost 3 horses, a gun, all his silverware, porcelain, and other personal effects. And there's a new document just obtained, and it provides more details. And in it states Captain John also lost several suits of cloth, 2 scarlet blankets with silver work and ribbons, 6 blue Stroud blankets, a bed, bedstead, curtains, pewter basins and plates, and 5,000 wampum in belts, etc. A woman named Susanna, who she might be Captain John's sister, lost 36 acres of land, unthreshed grain of several kinds, a house, 6 scarlet blankets trimmed with blue, 200 silver brooches, plow and harrow, 5 horses, 3 cows, 2 large and 7 small hogs, and 4 kettles. Molly Brandt, sister of Joseph Brandt, lost 2 dwelling homes, a barn, corn of all sorts, and personal goods, including a violin, amounting to over 1,200 pounds. These documents are so revealing about the community in the valley. Women held land, women had animals. It was a prosperous community. Their households and farms in Mohawk Valley, they really were substantial and valuable. And when you think about this community in the valley, the women and what they did was the backbone of the community, especially when able men were away at war. This isn't the first war or skirmishes that have been fought through the area. So that community, I think, is a testament to the women and their work. Part 5, the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte and the Simcoe Deed.
Right, 1783, and the end of the American Revolution. The British and the Americans came to terms of peace, but their allies were not considered in those terms. The issues of restoration and loss of lands were not part of the negotiations of the peace treaty. And justifiably, the Mohawks were furious that the British took it upon themselves to treaty away lands which were not theirs. Equally devastating was the reality that they couldn't go back home. And it was also true that they didn't want to stay in Lachine. The peace that ignored them and the promises made to them were the events that would drive them to establish a village elsewhere. And the Mohawks were also furious that the war was even declared over. They wanted to continue the fight. In a letter from January 1784, Captain John wrote to Daniel Claus about what the cessation of the war meant to his people.
We do not think they have beaten us. Our minds are still strong and determined to carry on the war. The disgrace is almost killing us. We warriors, the Garihoga, have steadfastly set our minds to fight to the end. We are joined with the king, but you can withdraw if you like.
Sir Frederick Haldimand, Governor General and commander of the forces, now had to act on that promise that he made in 1779 for a place of security for the Mohawks. In June of 1783, he sent the Surveyor General Samuel Holland to seek out potential settlement areas for the Six Nation allies. The area around Cataraqui was seen as a potential place of security for the Six Nations, and it was to be the site of a new military post. The general area was investigated by both Captain Joseph Brant and Captain John. Joseph Brant and his followers chose not to settle in the area. They went to Grand River instead. Captain John and his followers decided to stay at the Bay of Quinte area.
So April 1784, once the decision was made for the Bay of Quinte area, Captain John turned to the issues of when to go, how much land was to be set aside, the need for a deed, and other ways they needed help to establish and secure their new community. They wanted to get away from Lachine, and who could blame them, and start building a new community, something like returning to normal. Captain John wrote, "We would be glad to set out as soon as possible in order to get some Indian corn in the ground." So late April or early May of 1784, Captain John and his followers left Lachine for the Bay of Quinte. It's estimated that 20 to 22 families left in several canoes. Still, not everyone left Lachine at this time, and not everyone remaining at Lachine would first go to the Bay of Quinte.
Okay, I'll ask Jessica to go to image number 5, please. So the landing date is celebrated as the 22nd of May, 1784. According to Captain John, who was speaking in 1800, this was the date of the landing, and he provides our earliest description of the landing. It's the earliest one we have in our records anyway.
Colonel Claus wished to know what Indians were going to the Bay of Quinte and what to the Grand River. I told him I meant to set myself down at the Bay of Quinte among the Loyalists, and Captain Brant at the Grand River. I informed Colonel Claus I was not fond of going to the Grand River, owing to their being so near to the Americans, and told him I thought I could not live in peace so near these people, and made choice of this place as being at a greater distance from them. The Americans are like a worm that cuts off the corn as soon as it appears. Sir John Johnson and Colonel Claus told us on leaving Lachine they were happy we were going to a place we had appointed for ourselves. They hoped we should be happy and live in peace. We arrived here on the 22nd of May and found a great number of the native Mississaugas at this place, who were very glad to see us, and we were happy to be met in so friendly a manner. We then held a council with the Mississaugas and informed them our great father had purchased these lands for us and that we had come to sit down on them. It was a journey of about 200 miles.
So they were determined to rebuild their lives and build a new community. The early priorities, aside from getting a deed, which would actually take until 1793, included building their community. So the first building that went up was used as a meeting house and a school. There was the issue of getting a teacher. They wanted to build, and they did build a church. They were building their own homes, establishing their own farms, finding locations for mills, getting a blacksmith, and they requested government assistance for cows and horses and seeds.
And the community was different from the one at Lachine and different from the ones left behind in Mohawk Valley. The new village incorporated those from other First Nations, such as the Delaware. It also incorporated others, not First Nations people, who chose to remain with them. John Miracle was a man of Swedish ancestry. He'd been taken prisoner by the Kahnawake Mohawks. Although his relations took him back, in the end, John voluntarily decided to live with Mohawks. He may have married a Mohawk woman. His children became part of the community. Whether Mohawk, other First Nations, or non-Indigenous, they and their descendants became Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte.
And when Captain John was finally successful in obtaining a deed to the land, It's clear in the text of that document that the land was being granted to fulfill the promise that had been made first by Carleton and then by Haldeman. And it was a promise made because of the war. And I'll ask Jess to put up image number 6, please.
So the 1st of April, 1793 is the date of the Simcoe deed. And these are some of the words from it. Know ye that whereas the attachment and fidelity of the chief warriors and people of the Six Nations to us and our government have been made manifest on divers occasions by their spirited and zealous exertions and by the bravery of their conduct, and we being desirous of showing our approbation of the same, and in recompense of the losses they may have sustained, of providing a convenient tract of land under our protection for a safe and comfortable retreat for them and their posterity, have of our special grace certain knowledge and mere motion given, and by these presents do give and grant to them the chiefs, warriors, women, and people of the said Six Nations, and to have for the use and behoof of them and their heirs forever, freely and clearly, of and from all manner of rents, fines, or services, giving and granting by these presents, confirming to the said chiefs, warriors, women, and people of the said Six Nations, and their heirs, the full and entire possession, use, benefit, and advantage of the said district or territory of land, to be held and enjoyed by them in the most free and ample manner, and according to the several customs and usages by them, the said chiefs, warriors, women, and people of the said Six Nations, of securing to them the free and undisturbed possession and enjoyment of the same. Simcoe deed. What is true is that without the American Revolution and the dislocation from Fort Hunter to Lachine, and then Lachine to the Bay of Quinte, the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte would not exist.
Okay. Thanks so much. Now we'll go. Open for
Thank
questions,
you.
discussion, whatever.
I know I was thinking I should have mentioned earlier before we started the presentation that anyone who's here today, you're welcome to type your questions into the chat. Or if you would like to show your face on camera, you are welcome to do that as well. But please do type any questions in here now. But I am always amazed because we were discussing earlier how, you know, it is a presentation and it's very much but it's a conversation between the two of you. And I just am in awe because, you know, not needing really the visual aids, the presentation is so well laid out and dynamic, just, you know, with the back and forth, you know. And so I just love listening to the two of you, honestly.
Well, Karen's
I'm
great. Karen is so good. She is my color commentary person. You know, I'm sort of the play-by-play, and but she makes it come alive. How else? She's got the great voice, right?
Perfect voice for radio.
Yeah, it is a great voice for radio. But like both of you, honestly, it's very easy to listen to the two of you.
Well, Trish does the heavy lifting. She prepares all this, so she's the researcher.
We do have someone typing. Heather is typing. We're all in anticipation.
Make it easy.
Yeah. And I hope that those images worked for everybody too. Did they come up all right on your end?
Did on mine, anyway.
Good.
It's amazing to learn how they did live in Mohawk Valley, but you know, by then they'd had a couple hundred years of contact, and they had adopted or adapted many ways of living by then.
Yeah, very true. And I just stopped sharing my screen, but I'm sure that everybody in that is on the call would have seen the difference in size between the outline of the way the Mohawk Tract was in 1793 and the size of Tyendinaga Mohawk territory today. And I think most, if not all, of those land surrenders, I will put that word in quotes, happened prior to about 1830. right, Trish? Was all in
Um,
first 40
the
years,
last
give or take?
big one was 1843.
1843.
Yep. Yeah.
So within 50 years of the Mohawk Tract being officially granted, you
Mhm.
know, 3/4 of it had been
Yeah. Well,
reclaimed.
it
pretty
was
much.
very slyly done, right? The first surrender took the middle of the middle third, and I'm working on the back, so I can't share too much. Um, but that was a part of the agenda of the government.
Yeah.
I've
Okay,
done
Heather,
a
Heather's keeping us in suspense. I keep watching these 3 dots come up and then they go away and then they come back. It's like when you're waiting for a text message to come in. It's like, what's it gonna be? Oh my gosh. I might go ahead and I'll stop recording at this time. And then we can just wait and see if that question comes through. But I want to thank, oh, it just came through. Look at this. Look at this. All right. Ooh, it's quite a lot. Okay. I guess you can see that on your end as well. I'll read it aloud. Very interesting and would love to see it live. I'm guessing potentially visiting the Tyendinaga Mohawk territory or visiting the Sheen. I'm not sure. Heather, you can fill us in. I know it's not part of the move of the Mohawks, but when did the loss of the large tract of land happen? Right. So over time, but Trish can give more info on that. I have a 5 times United Empire loyalist who landed in New Brunswick in May of 1783 along with his troop. He eventually came through PEC, but then went on to York. I am surprised to hear of the small number of Mohawk families who came up.
Well, it's a small number that arrived at the Bay of Quinte. Remember, there was a much larger group that were at Fort Niagara, and that plus anybody who is following Joseph Brant, that becomes Six Nations of the Grand River. Yeah, so it is a split into a small group and a much larger group.
And I think in terms of the land surrenders, as Trish mentioned, they started happening very slyly. What size would those surrenders be at the beginning? Like, was it a few hundred acres and a few thousand acres?
The first surrender, if you want to bring up, if you can bring up the image
Oh,
of the
yes.
territory, the middle third was the first big surrender. It was 1820. It's 52 square miles.
Wow.
Yeah. It's the middle third. So it's from the northern boundary up past, just past Blessington, all the way from west to east, the whole middle third. And that is a current land claim with the government. So as I say, I can't get into too many details. But then the northern part is 2 surrenders. One is 1835, one is 1843. But of course, once that middle third is gone, it's almost impossible to defend that back third. How do you get to it? If that middle third is now occupied by all kinds of people, it's extremely difficult to defend that.
It's dividing. Yeah, divide and conquer. Yeah. Heather followed up, said, okay, thank you. By live, I meant the ladies in person at the museum telling the stories. Yes, I wish you could join us live too. Honestly, the 3 of us aren't together. We wish we could be together and we wish you could be here, Heather, and we could see you in person. Karen Valahora asks, which tribes were already in what is now called Prince Edward County when the Mohawks arrived? And do we know how many Indigenous people were already living here?
I have no idea how many. Occupying the North Shore of Lake Ontario were the Mississaugas primarily. They are Anishinaabe people. They lived in much smaller groups. They were not horticulturalists. They weren't farmers. They moved around a lot. And they indeed, that wasn't even their ancestral homeland. They had come from somewhere else. So people have moved through in and out. Karen, have I hit all of that?
Yeah, and sort of our oral history, if you will, says that that place was chosen by our people because it was familiar to us. We We went there to hunt and fish, and not to live, but to hunt and fish. And different village sites have been found. Not Prince Edward County, um, per se, I don't think, although there has been a lot of archaeological work done in the county. And there are many finds, and I think they are Iroquoian, are they not, Trish?
I believe they are. I wish I knew more about the archaeology. That's not really my area, but you're dealing with it, sort of like when you talk about the Huron-Wendat, very similar culture to the Haudenosaunee people, and so that was way back when they would have been going through. The Mohawks who were in what we now call Quebec were also using it as a pathway to get to hunting areas and fishing areas. It was kind of a pathway, into the north. And we're still building the story.
Yeah, I think it would be worth, maybe I should reach out to some of our contacts at Alderville First Nation, who, that is where, the Mississauga, the Michisauga from this area moved to, after the Loyalists arrived and the Mississauga were displaced from the region. So they might know how many families ended up, in the Rice Lake area, of course, also at Hiawatha and Curve Lake as well. So maybe I can do some of that on my own time, Karen, and follow up with you. But yeah, Prince Edward County was certainly such a, I mean, it's surrounded by water. It's so resource rich. So it just seems like for thousands of years, so many different nations had a connection to it or traveled through it. But as Trish mentioned, a lot of the archaeological finds in the county have been connected to quote unquote Iroquoian nations. So whether it be Haudenosaunee groups or the sort of ancestors of those groups or groups that have similarities culturally to the Haudenosaunee. So the Wendat and the St. Lawrence Iroquois, who were in the area about 800, 900 years ago. But yeah, so I don't know. I don't know whether that number would be in the hundreds or the thousands in terms of who was here at the time of the Mohawk arrival. Probably, I'm guessing in the hundreds, but I will follow up. And then Heather said, I live in Carrying Place and wonder who has walked here before. Any Indigenous people. I hope we answered that. Certainly at the Carrying Place as well, there was a Cayuga settlement in the 1600s there. So a Haudenosaunee presence in that area. It's very marshy here, likely a good place to hunt. Yeah, there's definitely a reason why so many groups have passed through this place. And then Karen says, thank you. But I think that's all for questions, guys. So now I will stop recording because I never did before. So thank you all for, Erin, my colleague, Erin is now typing. Oh my God. But, thank you for offering this tonight. Thanks for coming, Erin. Thanks for participating. Thank you to all. And I will share the link to the recording with everybody who's been here tonight so that before we are able to get it out on our YouTube channel, those of you who attended and people that might be interested in watching, please do share, even though Trish and myself and Karen were both hesitant to be seen on screen tonight. Okay, officially ending recording now.